Joe Rogan and Tulsi Gabbard slammed the federal government, Maui's response during a recent episode of the Joe Rogan Experience. Let's watch.
On television after a massive tragedy where we don't even know the number of people dead yet. You have this massive area that's been burnt to the ground.
Yeah.
And then he starts talking about taking it over for the state. That's an insane position to take.
It is.
Post-tragedy. When people are suffering at their most, they can't even believe it happened.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden he's saying, we're going to take it for the state and make a memorial? How about give the people their homes back?
Later, Gabbard described her experience speaking to the survivors of the fire.
Calculated how much money we had set aside for Ukraine. So we have an extra $4 billion to send now that we didn't know we had. And this has happened a few times. Secretary of State Tony Blinken went to Kyiv yesterday promising, hey, we're going to give you another $1 billion now. And this is the thing. When I was out there in Maui, person after person was like, Tulsi, tell me what would happen if we started to call ourselves Ukraine. You think they would give us some money then?
So I love the idea that people are drawing these direct comparisons between where the government is obviously willing to spend money, which is in overseas exploits and war, but not on domestic policy and the poor. This is the most famous Tupac lyric, and I'm glad to see it playing out here. Now, I am concerned about whether or not, one, it's going to be results driven because it is coming, it seems, exclusively from people who are not aligned with the Democratic Party. I would love to hear more of the progressive Democrats taking this line of approach and criticizing the ballooning military budget at the same time that it criticizes the lack of domestic spending. And I would also like to see some of these progressives call out conservatives who tried to obstruct the biggest domestic spending package, one of the biggest of all time, if not the biggest of all time, in the COVID relief package, at the same time that they are all going around the country taking credit for the money as it gets appropriated to their respective states. I think this is good. I think this is great. But if it's going to be results driven, I think it has to seem like less of a partisan exploit and more really geared toward putting pressure on those in power who have the power to distribute more aid to people in Maui, people in East Palestine, people in Chicago, people in San Francisco, people in Mississippi, and all around the country, not just on a partisan basis and where it makes Biden look bad.
Sure. I mean, getting the the Ukraine funding withdrawn or canceled, or the end of it would be a worthwhile goal in and of itself, in my opinion. So pointing out that hypocrisy, if it moves in the direction of Republicans saying, you're unwilling to fund all sorts of things, but Ukraine is a blank check, foreign policy in general is a blank check. Where's how is that possibly consistent? That's something that motivates a lot of libertarians make those arguments to try to turn Republicans into libertarians, to be like, you oppose all this, welfare spending, domestic spending, just spending in general. But then when it comes to our foreign projects, you write a blank check. How is that possibly consistent, and how can you justify that? So I hope those arguments take hold as a way to constrain what we're doing in Ukraine. Obviously, with emergencies like Maui, whatever whatever funds are designated for the purpose of emergencies, I think should be spent on them to make people's lives better there. Have we had any news or updates on what is going to be spent in Maui? I thought you said that there have been some funds approved.
Yes. Maui, I think this came out yesterday, is to receive nearly $95 million in federal aid for temporary housing and meals. The administration said this is a down payment on what is necessary, but it's essential help, and that they'll keep working hard to bring federal resources to the area. I've been following I believe a former representative from Hawaii who is progressive and has been critical of Biden's response throughout, who hailed this as a, quote, huge win. That's from Kaniela Ng. But, there is still this, I think, an interesting contrast that Joe Rogan and Tulsi Gabbard were raising with the comparison of the $6 billion that was found in the context of Ukraine aid that had fallen between the proverbial sofa cushions and the $95 million that's being allotted here. And the number, I haven't vetted it, but that they came up with in that clip that says it would take $5 billion to rebuild all of the homes that were lost. So again, I do think that drawing contrast between the incredible spending that we're willing to do in our military budget, and the way that domestic spending gets so much pushback. I mean, remember, we had a whole year of fighting over the infrastructure bill, and infrastructure was supposed to be one of those bipartisan notions where everyone can agree that the country needs its infrastructure from the middle of the last century to be updated. We have highways in Pennsylvania sliding into ditches, and we have flooding and wildfires across the country. We have a highway system that hasn't been updated in 70 years. We have dams that are cracking and bridges that are falling down. This should not be a political issue. You need an infrastructure for a country to run. But of course, it was an issue. And we got the bifurcation of Build Back Better. We got incredible cuts down to the teeth of these kinds of programs and down to the bitter end. And it came down to a largely partisan vote. So, we have to keep in mind that ideologically, there are differences between people who are more libertarian-minded and who might be making this argument and people who are more left-minded who are making this argument, because I think you would admit to libertarians want there to not be any more military spending, but they also don't want there to be domestic spending. So there's a way that it can sound like two people are both making the argument of drawing contrast between how dare you spend so much over there and not spend over here, but one camp also doesn't want them to spend over here. And if you really are invested in people in East Palestine and in Maui and in Flint, Michigan, and in Jackson, Mississippi, actually getting aid because you value them as citizens of this country who have been failed by their governments with lead in their pipes and fires ripping through their towns and a response system that hasn't been up to date and didn't work effectively, then you got to make sure that you're backing politicians who are actually incentivized, and who actually have as their goal distributing those funds and not just using military spending as a talking point.
Well, here's how I would respond to that. I mean, the reality is that the citizens of the country, including the citizens of Hawaii, do pay a lot in taxes. That money has been confiscated for them. There are better and worse uses for it. I think probably most people feel like, look, I mean, I'm not a total anarchist. I don't necessarily think the government shouldn't exist at all. Probably what the services people most want to get out of their government is basic police and fire and protection in the event of emergencies. I think that's what they feel like they're paying into it. Those are services that would have to be provided some way, even if there was no government, right? Even if it was all privatized or something. I mean, a society that doesn't have basic emergency services it's a tautology. It's not a society at all. So to the extent there's a proper role for government to play, and again, this is people's money, and it goes into a fund to be, the way an insurance system works. You're not necessarily going to use that, but you don't want to take the risk of having to pay the catastrophic toll yourself. So you pay into a fund, and then when that happens to someone, then they get to take the authority takes the money out of the fund and uses it on them. So I'm not objecting to an emergency payment system. And people have paid into a system where they expect to get something out of it. That said, the government's revenues are gigantic. So the idea that they can't find money to help people desperately in need, when people pay tax money so this can be taken care of, is, I can see why people are frustrated with that. I'm not necessarily saying there's anything wrong with that, although there might be a better system one could possibly design.
Yeah, well, people also pay tax money so that they aren't poor in old age. It's called Social Security. They pay tax money so that they can have health care in their old age. It's called, or if they're disabled, it's called Medicare and Medicaid. And you got people in both parties who routinely try to make cuts to those programs despite people paying in. When those programs have solvency issues, they don't say, okay, how about we remove the cap on rich people? If I make $1 billion a year, I pay exactly as much into Social Security as somebody who makes, I think the cutoff is like 160, like just under $200,000 a year. Does that make sense? Well, why not address that in terms of solvency?
They don't.
But instead, the plan has been to simply raise the retirement age and do things like that. So there, we're a little bit oversimplifying it here. I think that also we throw tons of money at incarcerating people for crimes of poverty, homelessness, things like that. When there was a recent study that showed just giving homeless people $7,000 ended up saving costs in terms of shelters, instead of just handing over the cash. So people have some interesting and not always well geared toward actually fixing the problem ideas about what is a good way to spend money to address the underlying problem.
Giving every homeless person in D.C. $7,000 meant there'd be no homelessness instead of whatever other government services we have to provide, of course I would do it in a snap of my fingers.
Oh, that's
whatever
good
is
to
the
hear.
cheapest way to not have crazy people on the streets living in tents, shouting at you and attacking you is absolutely fine with me. That doesn't, and if we don't have to put them in cages or detain them to do it, that's fantastic. I have serious doubts that is the case, but I would love to be persuaded otherwise.
All right, maybe we'll do it on a segment next week, because that new study was interesting. It wasn't obviously all homeless people. There's an addiction and mental health problem as well. But it was a cost savings to simply hand people money. We've seen this also with some studies that show what improves school performance is just giving families enough money so that the parents aren't taking on that second shift. They're home to make breakfast in the morning for their kid, to help them with their homework at night, does much more than throwing money at school districts even. So.
Yeah, well, we don't really disagree there. I've seen studies on various social issues that instead of designing a government program that needs to be administered by a bunch of, the more qualifications you put on, the more it's a program, the more it takes a bureaucracy to maintain it, the more you're just throwing away money and you're giving it to government employees, where it's just generally just, if you would, instead of setting up a bureaucracy and paying people to administer it, whatever the thing is, just giving that money back to people is probably a better
and means testing, which is people love, right? Conservatives historically have loved because they don't like the idea of undeserving poor getting their hands on some kind of program, saying that you have to have whatever work requirement or jump through whatever hoop, which of course doesn't exist when you're doling out PPP funds, but never mind.
Right.
But that's exactly, it's administrative bloat. It costs money to administer, and when we saw with the student debt example, it also gives people opportunity to challenge things in court and gum up the works instead of just giving people the money. So I like to see a little bit of simpatico here on this one, Robby.
How about that? We got there. More Rising right after this.